Evil Dead Burn tells the story of Alice, who seeks solace with her in-laws after the death of her husband, but things take a bloody turn when evil tracks the family down. Now, if you are gonna go see this movie in theaters, know there is a mid-credits scene and a post-credits scene, and trigger warning for DV and violence against a dog. Now, going into this movie, I expected a solid Evil Dead film at minimum, as so far all the movies in this franchise have been pretty solid, and this movie was no exception. I think this is a very solid Evil Dead film. It is very dark, and it is a lot darker and a lot meaner than Evil Dead Rise, and that did work for me. And I like the fact that it went as dark as it did, but it is not going to work for everybody. And another thing that actually surprised me about this movie is the last two movies, so Evil Dead and Evil Dead Rise, I wasn't a fan of the trend of the women getting it so much worse than the men in both those movies. But this time around in the movie, I actually will say that the women and the men actually got it somewhat equal this time. So I'm happy that that was not continued with this movie. But going into the things I liked about Evil Dead Burn, this movie has very solid acting performances from everyone across the board, including the lead. And this goes along also with physical performances, and Deadite performance is also pretty solid. This movie also has some very solid callbacks, specifically to Evil Dead 2 and Evil Dead Rise. I liked how they did that. It wasn't so much in your face, remember this. I like how they use that in the movie. This also has some very solid gore and practical when you do get it in the movie. And they use the topic of DV in this movie, and I was able to pick up that they were going to explore this topic in the first scene in the club. But it was confirmed by one line said by Alice in the car before going into the funeral. And I get a little nervous at some of those storylines like this. But I like how they use the storyline. Yes, it can be in your face at points, but I like how they presented it from the start to the end. It works and can absolutely look like that, so I do like that. But I also will say this movie has some very solid transitions, and this is more like the first few minutes because you have a very solid opening, not as brutal as Evil Dead Rise, but still a very solid opening, and the way you switch from the opening to the new characters also works very well. I also like why the family is being attacked by them. I think it's a bit of a lore forward for the franchise, which I also like, so I like that part of the movie. And I think this movie is paced very well, but at the end, the last few minutes feel a little dragged now that I've had some space from the movie, but still has a good pace-wise otherwise, so the last few minutes feel a little rushed. And the Deadites also still look pretty solid here too. But going into my mixed about this movie, they make a choice with the book reading, I will say. And I don't know how to entirely feel about that. When I first saw it on screen, I was just confused about it. And even now that I've had some time to think about it, I'm like, I don't know how to entirely feel about that. I just don't know. I haven't seen that in any of the previous Evil Dead movies, so I do have some questions a little bit about that, but yeah, I'm leaving it there. And the postcard scene is also a mix for me. This also can go to the one I mentioned before, as a little bit confused of how that directly works, but I don't know how they can connect the post-credit scene with the next movie. It could be a great movie, and I'm hoping it's a solid movie at minimum, but I don't know how to entirely feel about that choice with the post-credit scene. And my final mix here is the final boss. Now, some people aren't gonna like the final boss, but it looks better in some scenes and worse than others. There's one scene, like CGI fire behind it, that it does not look good at all, but I feel very mixed on it overall. I first saw it on screen, I'm like, I don't know, it looks okay, but I don't know how to entirely feel about it. And I think this movie is solid. 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 I think this But then then one didn't look great. I'm like, but I feel very mixed on it. But going into my cons for this movie, the dog violence. And this is just something I'm very sensitive to as of right now. When it comes to violence against animals, that is just something that is going to be any negative right now for any movie for me. So I just don't like seeing that on my screen right now. I lost my cat of 9.5 years a few weeks ago, and that's just something I just don't want to see on screen, so it's always going to be negative as of right now. And the CGI fire, again, it looks better in some scenes than others. So the CGI fire, it's mixed on the entirety of the movie for me. And this is more of a nitpick than anything, but something I did notice. Injuries at points are shown that it's actually affecting somebody, but then at some points injuries are just like treated like you have no injury and you're completely fine. And this is just a small part of the movie and small little quirk I have. There's one scene in this movie where someone gets seriously injured, and then like the next scene they're feeling completely fine, until they're not fine. But I just don't get how that person is like completely fine after, even how they got out of the situation they were in before. But that's just a small thing. Now going into the spoilers, let's go ahead and talk about the post-credit scene here. So if you don't want to hear about the post-credit scene, you can skip to my spoilers or for my conclusion of the video if you don't want to hear any spoilers. Now we get a the mid-credit scene, we get Alice with the ambulance asking what happened, and then you have the post-credit scene with the child that survived from Evil Dead Rise, who is at this funeral parlor they were in the funeral before, but she's basically asking the worker, what is going on? Why do we keep these? And apparently the mother's ashes from the previous movie is in here, and she speaks to her daughter through the mirror, and she comes at the end of the movie and says, Mommy's back. And I just don't know how I entirely feel about that continuation with Evil Dead Rise and how that would continue with the next movie. So I don't know, still feeling pretty mixed overall in the post-credit scene. Comment down below what you feel about that, if you saw that or have any feelings about that. But going into the spoilers, the lore, the lore they chose to explore with the weapon, I like that approach. We have some more moving forward, especially with the grandfather. And I like that they added that and why that was attached. You also see that weapon in, again, like a callback to Evil Dead 2. And that whole scene where she has to figure out the weapon, I did get a little laugh at too, so that was a fun scene. And the Evil Dead, the Deadite reading the book, that just, I don't know how that entirely works. We've never seen that in an Evil Dead movie before, and I was confused when I first saw that on screen, but I don't know. I just, could they always done that? It's just confusing how that works. And the ending with Alice surviving and the grandmother kind of continuing the curse forward and onward, I mean, it makes sense of why you try to push the story forward, as you know, they didn't all escape, but I don't know, the ending's fine. Another small thing I want to mention here is we see the dishwasher scene where he is on that dishwasher, but the next scene after the dishwasher scene, we see him somehow get off the dishwasher and fight a Deadite completely fine until it gets dragged off. The thing I want to talk about in the spoiler section here is the DV in the movie. I like how they showed the DV in the very beginning with the fight that he initiated, all the way after the fight when he comes out and he's immediately accusing her of doing something and how he storms off, and all the way in the beginning of the movie when she is surrounded by the enablers of everything. I knew the mother knew about everything the second she said something about having to raise the children. I've heard that line, so I just like how that was presented in the story and how they did show Alice that phase of everything. Again, it's not going to be for everyone, but it is a good way to show that in the story.
So, overall, this was another solid Evil Dead film. Comment down below if you saw Evil Dead Rise. Did you like it? Not like it? Comment down below and let's have a conversation.